all, thanks for tuning into this video. Now for Grade 5 theory exams, you're expected to have some general knowledge about the instruments of the orchestra. You should know what families they belong to, what clefs they use, and whether or not they're transposing instruments. Now the instruments of the orchestra divide neatly into 4 families: the strings, the woodwind, the brass, and the percussion. Let's start with the string family. The bowed stringed instruments are the violin, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. And it's also important to know something about the harp and something about the guitar. This is the violin. Its lowest note is G, printed on ledger lines below the treble clef. The next string is D, the next is A, the next is E. It can play much higher than E, depending on the skill of the player. There are really squeaky notes called harmonics that you can get as well. But the lowest note is G. The violin is always, violin music is always written in the treble clef. There are a couple of special techniques you can do on the violin. There's tremolo. Tremolo is this. When you make a trembling sound with the bow. Then there's sul ponticello. Sul ponticello means on the bridge. This is the bridge. So I move my normal playing position from here to here. If I do a tremolo, sul ponticello. And then there's sul tasto. Now tasto means touch. Tasto is the fingerboard. Sul tasto means that you move so that you're playing over the edge of the fingerboard. To get another different kind of sound. Now this is actually a violin, but I've tuned the strings so they match the sounds of the viola. So the 4 strings on the viola are the low C, below middle C, the G, the D, and the A. This is the cello. This is one of the few instruments of the orchestra where you really have to sit down to play the cello. It has a spike on the bottom that rests on the floor, and then you put it between your legs. Your left hand, just like on the violin, is up on the fingerboard. Your right hand has the bow. And the strings are tuned to a low C, a G, a D, and an A. And just like on a violin, there's no real upper limit to how high you can go, but there is that lower limit of the low C. When the cello's playing down there, bass clef. When it goes up a bit higher, it uses the tenor clef, and just occasionally it might be printed in the treble clef. Now this is a double bass. It's not a full-size double bass. I think this one's half size. Most professionals don't use full-size basses. Full-size double basses are huge. Notice it has sloping shoulders. Unlike the other members of the string family, this is an older instrument. It's actually a double bass viol. It's a member of the viol family. But we use it today. Now the highest string on this is a G. Then we've got D, A, and a low E. Fantastic sound. It sounds an octave lower than it's printed. Now, if I use the bow, it's called arco. If I pluck, it's called pizzicato. woodwind instruments most commonly found in the orchestra are the flute, the oboe, the clarinet and the bassoon. Of these four instruments, the clarinet is a transposing instrument, and so is the saxophone. This is an orchestral flute. It's the highest sounding member of the woodwind family. It's not a transposing instrument, so if the player sees a C and plays a C, out comes a C. Now middle C is actually the lowest note of the flute. That's the one. It's quite hard to play, the low middle C. The flute is really designed to play up high, and good players can get the top D way above the stave. Now, woodwind instruments can do tonguing and slurring. Tonguing is when you start every note with your tongue like this. And slurring is when you don't use your tongue, you just move your fingers. On the flute it's quite easy to do double tonguing when you go t-k, t-k, t-k. Or even flutter tonguing when you go while you play. This is the oboe. Alongside the flute, it plays in the treble range of the orchestra, and its music is written in the treble clef. It plays at concert pitch. So if I see G, A, B, and I play G, A, B, those are the sounds that you will hear. It has a double reed. So if I take this out, there are two reeds here, tightly bound together. The bassoon also has a double reed, whereas the clarinet and saxophone have a single reed. So this is a double reed instrument that does not transpose. Its lowest note is B flat, and its highest note is a top C. This is my lovely, lovely new clarinet. The clarinet has the biggest range of the woodwind instruments. It can play right down from a low E up to top A and a little bit beyond. Now it's a transposing instrument, so when I play a middle C, I look at a middle C on the page, I play a middle C, what you actually hear is a B flat. So we call this a clarinet in B flat. You can also get a clarinet in A, and on the clarinet in A, you play middle C, out comes an A. You can get a clarinet in C. You play middle C, out comes a C, but they're not so common. The B flat clarinet is the most common one. The bassoon is another double reed instrument. It plays at concert pitch. Its lowest note is a very low B flat, and its highest note, again, depends on the ability of the player, but let's say a very high E flat. This is the saxophone. This particular saxophone is an alto saxophone in E flat. That means that when I play the note C, out comes an E flat, 6 notes lower. There's also the tenor saxophone, and when you play a C on a tenor saxophone, out comes a B flat. So that's called a tenor saxophone in B flat. In fact, there's a whole family. The soprano saxophone is in B flat, the alto is in E flat, the tenor is in B flat, and the baritone is in E flat. Now on all of those instruments, the lowest note that the player reads and that the player plays is B flat, and the highest is F sharp. But of course different sounds come out the end. Now the saxophone, like the clarinet, is a single reed instrument. So it has a single reed that lies flat against the plastic or metal mouthpiece. The brass instruments of the orchestra are the trumpet, the horn, the trombone and the tuba. This is the trumpet. It's called the B-flat trumpet because when I see middle C and I play middle C, the note you're actually hearing is a B-flat. So if I see an arpeggio of C major on my trumpet music, that's actually B-flat major on the piano. So this is a trumpet in B-flat. It's the highest sounding of all the brass instruments. I can't demonstrate the top notes because I'm not terribly good at the trumpet. You have to make your lips very small, very fast. It's just not going to happen today. There's a relatively high note, but you can easily have a listen to some good trumpeters. If you listen to the Duke Ellington Orchestra or the Michel Camillo Band, or any music by Dizzy Gillespie, you'll hear some super high notes. Now all the brass instruments have valves. If I play with no valves, I can get 1, 5, 1. If I want any notes in between, I use the valves. To get those chromatic notes. This is a horn. This is in the brass section and has a kind of alto tenor range. Its music is written in the treble clef and sometimes in the bass clef. Now, this is a horn in F, which means if I don't use any valves and I play what looks like a middle C, the sound that comes out the end is actually an F. Just like all the brass instruments, if I don't use valves, I can get an arpeggio. So if I play C, E, G, you will hear F, A, C. This is a trombone. It plays in the tenor range. But its music is notated in the bass clef normally, sometimes the tenor clef. Now its lowest note is E. That would be notated in the bass clef. And then up high, it would be notated in a tenor clef. Now when it's at its shortest, so the slide's not extended, but when the slide is right in, it plays a B flat. You can get B flat, F, B flat. 1, 5, 1, 5, 1 in the key of B flat. Now you can get the arpeggio of B flat. 1, 5, 1, 3, 1, 5, 1. Without moving the slide. And then to get the notes in between, you move the slide. Now one thing of course the trombone can do that a lot of instruments can't do is the glissando. In classical music you might see the instruction con sordini, which means with the mute. So I have a selection of mutes here. I have the cup mute, which makes this sound. If I take the cup off and just use this bit, it's a straight mute. This is a straight mute. And then this is a plunger mute or a wah-wah mute. This actually is a toilet plunger. Never seen a toilet though. Now all the brass instruments can be muted, as can all the strings. In string music it will often just say consordini, using the mute for the violin, which is a small piece of rubber that goes on the bridge. With the brass family, you often have to be a bit more specific as to what kind of mute you use, in which case they say it in English. There's cup mute, straight mute, the Harmon mute, a variety of mutes that you can use. This is the tuba. This is the largest and the lowest sounding of all the brass instruments. This particular tuba is an E-flat tuba, which means that this note is E-flat when I don't use any vowels. Now, as with the other brass instruments, I can get the fifth above and the octave above without vowels. If I press a valve down, I get a different set of notes. Now, it's called the E-flat tuba because when I don't use valves, it plays an E-flat. But this is not a transposing instrument. The music is written in the bass clef at concert pitch. So if the player sees E-flat, he plays this note, and E-flat comes out the end. The only exception to this is in the brass band and marching band tradition, when the music is notated in the treble clef and the tuba player calls this note C. That enables trumpeters to switch to tuba because it ends up being the same fingering as a trumpet. But for the most part, this is not a transposing instrument and its music is written in the bass clef. There are all sorts of percussion instruments in the orchestra. More often than not, there will be timpani. There may also be snare drums, triangles, cymbals, xylophones, glockenspiels, maracas, castanets, gongs, all sorts of instruments. This is the snare drum, a very familiar drum because it's found in drum kits. It's an example of an untuned percussion instrument. Of course, you can do drum rolls on a snare drum. You can just use ordinary sticking. You can do a rim click, which is where you just hit the rim of the drum. You can do a rim shot, which is where you hit the rim and the skin simultaneously. And I rather like the sound of the snare drum when you use brushes. Now it's called the snare drum because underneath there are these metal snares, and you can take them off. Sometimes you'll have the instruction to take off the snares, in which case it sounds like this. Bass drum is amazing, it's huge. The bass drum beater is huge. I've got a fluffy one here for soft sounds, and I've got a harder one for harder sounds. The bass drum is an orchestral instrument of indefinite pitch. These are the orchestral cymbals. They're another example of an untuned percussion instrument. These particular ones are 17 inches. It's important not to crash them straight into each other, but to use a sort of sideways glance. Here's another untuned percussion instrument that you'll be familiar with, the triangle. Don't hit it on the side or it will start spinning and you'll be chasing it round. What you do, you put your stick in the middle and hit downwards. Or you can do a trill in the corner. Sometimes you'll see the triangle mounted in a frame so the player can use two sticks to do more complex rhythms. It's an untuned percussion instrument. Now these drums are known as the kettle drums or the timpani, and they are tuned percussion instruments. They have notes of definite pitch. At the moment this one is G, G, and this one is C, C, I want a different note, I have to loosen the drum skin or tighten the drum skin until I have that different note that I want. You can get timpani with pedals so that you can change notes quickly. I'm not lucky enough to have them, but I do have some timpani. Now xylophones are made of wood, glockenspiels are made of metal. So what do I have here? It's a xylophone. It comes from the Greek xyle, meaning wood, phone, meaning sounding, a wooden sound. This is a tuned percussion instrument. Now, xylophones are made of wood, glockenspiels are made of metal. So what do I have here? It's made of metal, so it's a glockenspiel. It comes from the German, Glock being a bell and Spiel being to play. This is a glockenspiel. It's an example of a tuned percussion instrument. It's also good to know a little bit about the drum kit, and in particular drum kit notation. When you're writing for drum kits, rather than each line of the stave being a separate pitch, each line of the stave represents a different instrument of the kit. So the bottom line is the bass drum. This is the floor tom, this is the snare drum, this is the medium tom, this is the high tom. This symbol indicates that you press the hi-hat down with your foot. This symbol means you hit the hi-hat with the stick. This is the ride symbol, this is the crash symbol, and this symbol is sometimes used for the cowbell. You may find slight variations in this, as there isn't a universal standard of drum notation. This is the drum kit. The bass drum, which I operate with my right foot, is notated on the bottom space of the stave. The hi-hat, which I operate with my left foot, is also notated low down on the stave as a little cross. The snare drum is notated on the third space. Either as a regular note, or when it's a cross, it's asking for a rim click. The tom-toms are notated in various places of the stave. There's the high tom, the medium tom, and the low tom. Then, if the composer wants you to hit the cymbals with sticks, they'll be notated as crosses at the top of the stave. Either the hi-hat, or the ride, or when it's up on the leisure line, the crash. Now, drum kit notation does vary a bit. It's not an international understood standard, but it tends to be along those lines. This is a classical guitar. You don't often find it in the orchestra because it would struggle to be heard above the other instruments. The strings are tuned to E, A, D, G, B, and E. Now, the notation is always in treble clef, but what the listener hears is actually an octave lower than what the guitarist is reading. Now, this rather lovely thing is an E-flat harp. It plays at concert pitch, so although it's called an E-flat harp, it's not a transposing instrument. It's called an E-flat harp because if I play these strings now, I'll get a scale of E-flat major. In order to play any other scale, E-flat major, in order to play any other scale, I need to tweak a few things. So if I lose all the A flats, if I make them A naturals, now I've got B flat major scale. And if I put every lever up, I have E major scale. So this harp, this particular harp, can play in any key up to 3 flats or 4 sharps. So it's slightly limited, but it's a lovely sized instrument. Now the big concert harps that you see, really big, they're called C flat harps. They're actually tuned to C flat major. And every string can be tweaked up to become a natural or a sharp, so that you can play in any key. And you don't have to use the levers, it has a foot pedal. So if I want to suddenly change all the F flats into F naturals, I press the pedal. And if I want to turn them into F sharps, I press the pedal again. So the harp works really well in major and minor keys. It's not so good at chromatic scales because it's designed to do major and minor scales. Now you'll notice that some of the strings are coloured. They have to be, else I'd never know where I was. The C's are all red, the F's are all black. Now the organ, of course, comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. The organ I play most regularly is fairly small. It's got 2 keyboards, it's got some stops, and these are the different sounds. You can have this sound, you can add this, add this, add this, and you can have a contrast on the top keyboard. And then I've got pedals as well. The organ pedals are just like another keyboard, so I've got C, D, E, I've even got C sharp. So I've got white notes and black notes. My lowest pedal is the bottom C below the bass clef. Now organ music is written on 3 staves: right hand, left hand and pedals, treble, bass and bass. Now the range of the organ is very much determined by what stops you have. So I can play middle C and I can make it sound like middle C, or an octave higher, or an octave higher. And if I had more stops, I could go higher and higher and lower and lower. So the size of your instrument really does determine the range of sounds and the range of pitches you can make. It's important to know about vocal ranges. The 4 main voices are soprano, alto, tenor and bass. These are the voices you'll find in most choral works. There's also a mezzo-soprano, which lies somewhere in between soprano and alto, and baritone, which lies somewhere in between tenor and bass. Now these ranges are approximate because they all depend on the individual singer. But the approximate range of a soprano is this. The mezzo-soprano slightly lower, the alto slightly lower. And then for the male voices, the approximate range of a tenor is this, the baritone slightly lower, and the bass slightly lower. Sadly, I can't demonstrate all those voice types for you because I'm a bass. I can't demonstrate soprano to you today.
At the piano. Play through a piano piece while thinking about what instruments might play each melody and each part of the texture. How might the composer orchestrate the piece?
That was fun. I just played every single instrument of the orchestra in one afternoon. Now, chapter 27 of this book, There's More to Playing the Piano, suggests that you should play through some of your piano music while thinking about other instruments. Now, I'm going to start by playing a fugue by Bach. Whenever we play fugues, we use the vocabulary of the voices: soprano, alto, tenor and bass. This fugue has 3 melodies, 3 independent lines that weave in and out. Because there are 3 melodies, I'm going to call them soprano, alto and bass. It starts with the alto. Then the soprano comes in. Then the bass. So when we're learning fugues, we always say, oh, there's the bass entry there and that bit where the soprano and alto are playing. It doesn't necessarily mean we're thinking how it would sound on a voice, but it's useful vocabulary. Now, here's a piece of music by Mussorgsky called The Old Castle, and it was written for piano. Now you may recognise that tune. It's likely, if you recognise it, that you've actually heard it played by an orchestra. Because Ravel, when he played this whole piece, which is called Pictures from an Exhibition, when Ravel played this piece, he could hear all sorts of instruments and colours in his mind, so he wrote an orchestral version. He chose to start with cellos, doing this drone. Then when it gets staccato with a little melody in the tenor, bassoons sprang to mind. Then it goes back to strings. And then the alto saxophone gets one of its rare outings in orchestral music, playing the melody. Now, throughout history, composers have arranged piano music for orchestra or arranged orchestral music for piano. It's always good just to think about the different colours in your playing so that the texture comes alive. Different parts might have different articulation to other parts, and thinking about instruments is a great way into that and a great way to bring your music to life.